At 6 o'clock on the evening of Saturday, the 6th of October 1979, Paul Volcker convened an emergency meeting of the Federal Open Market Committee in Washington. It was a Saturday. The markets were closed. Most of the committee members had been called back from weekend plans. Volcker was 51 years old, 6 feet 7 inches tall, and had been chairman of the Federal Reserve for exactly 63 days. He stood before his colleagues and proposed something that no Fed chairman had done before. He was going to abandon the Federal Reserve's decade-long practice of targeting interest rates and instead target the money supply directly. In practical terms, this meant accepting that interest rates could rise to whatever level was necessary to break inflation. There would be no ceiling, no political accommodation, no gradual approach. American inflation had peaked at 14.8% in March of that year. The decade-long experiment with accommodative monetary policy had produced a currency that was losing purchasing power faster than at any point since the Second World War. Volcker had been appointed specifically because the Carter administration had concluded that only a man willing to inflict genuine pain could restore credibility to the dollar. The announcement on that Saturday evening was later known by a nickname, the Saturday Night Special. Within 2 years, the federal funds rate reached 20%. The prime lending rate hit 21.5%. An entire continent, one that had borrowed in dollars under the assumption that rates would remain manageable, was about to discover the full cost of one man's decision in one room on a Saturday in Washington. Paul Volcker was not an ideologue. He was an institutionalist, a man who believed that the Federal Reserve's most essential function was to maintain price stability, and that the institution had spent a decade failing at that function with increasingly damaging results. He had written his Princeton undergraduate thesis in 1949 on the Federal Reserve's post-war policy failures. He had watched the stop-go monetary policy of the 1960s and 1970s, the repeated cycles of raising rates to contain inflation, then cutting them under political pressure before the job was done. Each cycle left inflation slightly higher than before. Each retreat eroded the Fed's credibility. By 1979, the institution had effectively lost the public's trust that it could or would control prices. Volcker understood that breaking inflation was not primarily a technical problem. It was a credibility problem. Markets, businesses, and workers had come to expect continued inflation, and they were building those expectations into wage negotiations, contract pricing, and investment decisions. The inflationary spiral was self-reinforcing. The only way to stop it was to do something so decisive, so unambiguous, and so painful that no rational actor could doubt the Fed's commitment. That was what the Saturday Night Special was. Not a routine policy adjustment, a declaration of intent that interest rates would go wherever they needed to go for as long as necessary, regardless of the political consequences. Before we go further, if this kind of history matters to you, consider subscribing to the channel. Every video here is built around the financial decisions that actually changed the world. The crises, the policy failures, the moments when the system revealed what it was designed to protect. If that is the kind of analysis you want to keep watching, the subscribe button is how you tell us. And we want to hear from you. Did you live through one of these turning points? The 2008 collapse, the 70s oil shock, the end of Bretton Woods? Did it change your family's circumstances, your understanding of how money actually works? Leave it in the comments. The most complete record of these events is not in any official report. It is in the people who were paying attention. Now, back to the account. Here is the mechanism that most people miss. The precise pathway by which a decision made inside the Federal Reserve building in Washington destroyed the finances of governments thousands of miles away. When the Federal Reserve raises interest rates in the United States, it does not raise them only in the United States. The dollar is the world's reserve currency and the dominant currency of international lending. Most sovereign debt issued by developing countries in the 1970s was denominated not in the borrower's domestic currency, but in US dollars. The loan from the American bank to the Mexican government was written in dollars. The interest calculation was tied to the prevailing US rate. When that rate moved, the debt payment moved with it. A country borrowing at a floating rate linked to U.S. short-term interest rates in 1978, when the federal funds rate averaged around 7%, was servicing its debt at a manageable cost. When the same country was servicing the same debt in June 1981, with the federal funds rate at 20%, its interest burden had nearly tripled. The underlying economy had not grown 3 times larger. The debt itself had not changed. Only the rate had changed. Only one man in one building had changed it. The mechanism operates in a second channel as well. High U.S. interest rates attract capital, dollars that might otherwise flow to emerging markets seeking yield, financing Latin American development projects, purchasing government bonds, supporting local currencies, return instead to the United States, where returns are now guaranteed and risk-free. The capital outflows from Latin America that accompanied the Volcker shock were not the result of any failure in those economies. They were the mathematically predictable response to a Washington rate decision. The dollar also strengthened dramatically. A stronger dollar meant that every barrel of oil, every ton of imported machinery, and every debt service payment now cost more in local currency terms. The countries most exposed were precisely those with the largest dollar-denominated debt loads and the least capacity to earn dollars through exports. The vulnerability had been built across an entire decade. To understand the 1982 crisis, you have to understand what happened in the 1970s and why it seemed, at the time, entirely rational. After the 1973 oil embargo, Arab oil-producing states accumulated surpluses of petrodollars too large to invest domestically. Those surpluses flowed into the international banking system. American and European commercial banks found themselves holding tens of billions of dollars that required deployment. They found their borrowers in Latin America. Between 1975 and 1982, Latin American debt to commercial banks increased at a cumulative annual rate of over 20%. The region's total external debt quadrupled, from $75 billion in 1975 to more than $315 billion by 1983. At the time, this borrowing appeared justified. Commodity prices were high. Brazil's economy had been growing at 9% annually through the 1960s and 1970s. Mexico had discovered major new oil fields and was borrowing against future production revenues. Venezuela was flush with oil income. The loans were cheap. Real interest rates were often near zero or negative in the inflationary environment of the late 1970s. By 1982, the 9 largest American banks held Latin American debt amounting to 176% of their own capital. The banks had not made a bad bet in the 1970s. They had made a bet that was rational under one set of monetary conditions and catastrophic under another. The change in conditions was the Volcker shock. Latin America had borrowed in dollars on the assumption that U.S. interest rates would remain at the levels that had prevailed when the loans were signed. That assumption was not unreasonable. It was not a misreading of the available information. It was simply the assumption that a decision made in Washington, in one room, on one Saturday, would not render the entire architecture of their development financing unserviceable overnight. In the first week of August 1982, Jesus Silva Herzog, Mexico's finance minister, flew to Washington carrying a message that no finance minister wants to deliver to a creditor's capital. Mexico could no longer service its debt. The total outstanding was $80 billion. The scheduled debt payments could not be met. He informed the Federal Reserve Chairman, the United States Treasury Secretary, and the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund directly, in person. The announcement came on the 12th of August. Within days, the international capital markets effectively shut down for Latin America. Banks that had been competing to lend 3 years earlier now refused to extend new credit and began to call in existing lines. Brazil, Venezuela, Argentina, and 11 other Latin American countries had followed Mexico's position within months. 16 nations in total eventually rescheduled their debts. By the end of 1983, 47 countries worldwide had been affected. The arithmetic of the crisis was unambiguous. Mexico's GDP per capita had been converging toward American levels throughout the 1970s, rising from 19% of the US level in 1960 to 39% by 1982. After the crisis, it collapsed back to 23% of the US level by 1995. A generation of economic convergence had been reversed in 3 years. For the 9 largest American banks, the exposure was existential. Their combined Latin American loan portfolios represented 176% of their capital. Had the losses been fully recognized immediately, 7 or 8 of the 10 largest banks in the United States would have been deemed insolvent. American bank regulators knew this. They allowed the banks to delay recognizing the full extent of those losses, regulatory forbearance on a scale that would not be publicly acknowledged for years. The banking system survived. The continent did not. The decade that followed Mexico's August 1982 default became known, without exaggeration, as the Lost Decade. Between 1982 and 1985 alone, Latin America transferred $108 billion back to its creditors, in a region where most of the population lived on incomes that would be considered poverty wages in the lending countries. The transfer went in one direction. Development went in none. Per capita GDP in the region fell for 3 consecutive years following the crisis. Real wages in Latin American urban areas dropped by between 20 and 40% over the decade after 1980. Investment that might have addressed social needs, schools, hospitals, infrastructure, was redirected entirely to servicing foreign debt. In Brazil, inflation reached triple digits by the mid-1980s. In Argentina, it passed 1,000% by 1989. In Bolivia, it briefly touched 50,000% annually in 1985. Hyperinflation triggered not by any domestic monetary failure, but by a debt crisis whose origins lay in a Saturday evening meeting in Washington 5 years earlier. Mexico was classified by economic historians as having experienced a Great Depression between 1982 and 1995, a fall in GDP per working-age person from its long-term trend of more than 20% in total, lasting 13 years. The IMF moved into the region with structural adjustment programs, requirements of budget austerity, privatization, and trade liberalization as conditions for emergency lending. These programs reduced deficits, but also dismantled social protections built over decades. The adjustment costs fell overwhelmingly on the populations that had borrowed the least and owned the fewest assets denominated in foreign currency. The scale of the human cost bears stating plainly. Millions of people in Latin America experienced falling living standards, shrinking public services, and rising unemployment, not because of any decision their own governments had made, but because one man in Washington had decided, correctly and courageously, that American inflation needed to end. Paul Volcker succeeded. American inflation fell from 14.8% to 3% by 1983. The Federal Reserve's credibility was restored. The dollar stabilized. The great inflation of the 1970s was over. The structural damage to the American economy that persistent inflation had been causing, the distortion of investment, the erosion of savings, the destruction of long-term planning, began to be repaired. This is the story that Washington tells about the Volcker shock. It is accurate. It is also incomplete. The full story includes the fact that between 1982 and 1985, Latin America transferred $108 billion to its creditors, whilst the populations of those countries experienced falling real wages, collapsing public services, and the systematic reversal of a generation's development gains. The full story includes the fact that 7 or 8 of the largest banks in the United States might have been declared insolvent had the government required honest accounting of their Latin American losses, and that the government chose not to. The full story includes Mexico's 13 years of depression, Bolivia's 50,000% hyperinflation, a continent's lost decade. The mechanism that produced this outcome has not been dismantled. Dollar-denominated debt remains the dominant form of sovereign borrowing for developing countries. When the Federal Reserve raises rates as it did sharply between 2022 and 2024, the consequences still travel south. The dynamics that bankrupted Latin America in 1982 are not a historical curiosity. They are the permanent architecture of the global financial system. Volcker himself understood the moral weight of what he had done. In his memoir, he acknowledged the collateral damage to developing country debtors whilst maintaining that the alternative, allowing American inflation to continue unchecked, would have been worse. He was probably right. That judgment does not reduce the cost borne by those who had no seat at the Saturday night table. If this account has given you a clearer understanding of how financial power actually operates, subscribe to the channel. There are more crises, more decisions, more turning points still to document. And if this period of history connects to something you lived through or something a family member witnessed, the bank runs, the inflation, the austerity, the moment a system everyone trusted stopped working, tell us in the comments. What did they see? What did it cost them? What did they believe afterwards? The official version of these events is always written by the institutions that survived them. The fuller version belongs to the people who did not.